Hello, everyone. I'm John Anderson, president of Greenleaf Communities. We research solutions to environmental problems, including climate change. Today, we will discuss a policy approach that accelerates the adoption of many solutions to the problem, and that is putting a price on carbon and doing so at a global scale. Dr. Francine van den Brandeleer directs our research, and she will share with you what many believe is the key piece of the climate solutions puzzle.
Hello, my name is Francine, and I lead climate research and policy at Greenleaf Communities, a nonprofit that applies research for a healthy and sustainable world. And today, I'd like to talk about carbon pricing, and more specifically, a carbon fee and dividend approach, as an essential tool for the US to meet its climate mitigation targets. So first, let's take a quick look at the climate science. The graph on the left shows different pathways for future global greenhouse gas emissions. The graph on the right links these emissions pathways to different scenarios for increases in global average temperatures. To avoid the worst climate change impacts, which means no more than 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, global carbon emissions will have to decline significantly. We talked with Dr. Don Weebbles about the climate science. Dr. Wuebbles is a professor of atmospheric science at the University of Illinois. He was a climate advisor under the Obama administration and a co-leader of the 4th National Climate Assessment. He's an expert in atmospheric physics and chemistry with over 500 scientific publications on the Earth's climate, air quality, and the stratospheric ozone layer. Hello, Don, and thanks for being with us.
Certainly, Francine.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about these different climate scenarios, which ones we should aim for and which ones you feel are the most likely.
But in order to look at the future, we have to have a way of saying, well, what is carbon dioxide and methane and emissions of other gases and particles going to look like in the future? So we use scenarios for that. And those scenarios make various assumptions. So a high scenario, for example, makes the assumption that we're going to continue to heavily use fossil fuels in the future, and that land use change will continue as it has in the past. A middle scenario, or actually what we call a low scenario in the figure, is based on the assumption that by mid-century, humans have decided to switch away from fossil fuels largely and to head more and more to other sources of energy and transportation. So that scenario is, we don't consider it to be a policy scenario, but it could be. The policy related ones definitely would be, if we're going to go to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees centigrade increase, double that if you want to get the Fahrenheit. We're already at 1 degree centigrade. And if we want to hold it to 1.5 or 2 degrees, then we have to really make strong actions starting right now. And so there are scenarios that look at those as well. The figure I think you're going to show has the 2 degree scenario in it that we use in these models. So the numerical models of the physics and chemistry and biology affecting our Earth system are very, very expensive to run on the largest possible computers we can get our hands on. So we can only run a limited number of scenarios for the future. So that's why we don't look at the full range of possibilities. We look at a limited range, but it kind of extend over the full envelope of what can be looked at. And then from those, we can get the resulting temperature change given those emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, et cetera. We might be talking about 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature relative to current temperatures by the end of this century. Huge. If you look at past changes in climate, like during the Ice Age, the Ice Ages were about 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than now. So if you imagine 8 to 10 degrees warmer than now, we're talking about a substantial change that is outside of the human experience because there weren't many humans around during the time of the last Ice Age. So that's going to be very difficult on our society and also very difficult on ecosystems. At the same time, if we can reach one of the lower scenarios, we're maybe talking about 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase. We can keep those temperatures down. And so the choice is ours between now and then as to what the emissions we're going to have as determining which of these pathways are we likely to follow.
So you're talking about pretty substantial potential increases in temperature, and I'm assuming that translates in different types of climate impacts that that we will experience. So can you tell us a little bit about what those impacts are?
Yeah, the media likes to talk about global warming. It's not just about warming, it's about the impacts on the intensity of severe weather. Uh, the fact that you get more heat waves is one aspect of that, but also when you get precipitation or rainfall or snowfall, it's more likely to be a larger event already, and even more so into the future. So that means a more likelihood for floods. In some areas are going to see less rainfall overall than they've had in the past. Some places are going to see more rainfall than overall in the past. So that leads to a possibility of droughts in some places and floods in others. And sometimes even in a place like Illinois, where you can get the combination of the two, where it overall there's more rainfall, but the summers are likely to be drier, so you can have more flooding. So Florida is kind of similar to that, where Florida may be subject both to droughts at times and to intense rainfalls at times, and flooding possibilities. On top of that, of course, we also have the concern for the coastal areas with sea level rise, and we've already seen about 7 to 8 inches of sea level rise over the last century. And we expect to see another 1 to 4 feet over this century, with the remote possibility that could be as high as 8 feet. And that depends on what's going on in West Antarctica. We now think that that's going to slow down to the point where that won't be as major an issue as we thought a few years ago. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about that. But even 3 feet puts major cities in Florida and elsewhere along our East Coast into jeopardy. And part of that is because at the same time that the sea levels are rising, the geological plates are also moving, and it's driving the land in the East Coast down. And so you get a double whammy for the eastern part of the United States.
So it's hard for a lot of people to sort of relate these global dynamics with what's really happening at the local level that they experience, they feel. So how do you link these dynamics, these global dynamics, with the local level impacts?
So we're trying to do a lot of studies now to try to understand the local impacts more clearly. And we use what are called downscaling approaches to look at that. In fact, I just recently published a book about that. It just came out. This is on downscaling techniques for high resolution climate projections. Really exciting title. I'm sure it's going to be a bestseller. 6 of us, 6 top scientists got together and wrote this. But the reason we wrote it is because people trying to understand the impacts of climate change at their local level, and whether it be on their energy systems or their water systems or their transportation systems or agriculture or many other potential possibilities, infrastructure of various sorts, don't really know how to use climate information. Yet they need to if they're going to look at what their future might be like and what jeopardy, what risk that their systems are going to be, their infrastructure is going to be in. So this book is really aimed at looking at that. Basically, we use 2 different techniques, and I'm actually working hard right now and kind of pushing the science limits on those techniques. We're doing statistical downscaling, and we have a new technique we think is more accurate than any of the past techniques. And that can get us in the US down to about 6 kilometer resolution, so about 4 miles. So climate doesn't change a whole lot over a 4-mile distance normally. So that's useful for lots of information, but it's also limited to temperature and precipitation changes. The other technique is called dynamical downscaling or regional modeling. And with the regional model, we can look at many, many variables. So we can look at winds, and we can look at changes in humidity, more detailed understanding of how storms will affect humans. So we think by doing both of those, we think we can help those communities that are really trying to understand, whether it be a rural community worried about how agriculture or how flooding is going to, river flooding may affect their community, or an urban city where you got all kinds of infrastructure issues related to transportation and water and all kinds of things that need to be understood in much more detail.
Well, I have a final question, and a lot of this is very preoccupying, and I'm sure a lot of people are worried. And what would you like to say about our hope for addressing this global climate crisis? And do you see any possibility for the global community to come together and address this?
Yeah, so when I was at the White House in 2015, 2016, we were helping the president and the government try to sort out the development of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is a purely voluntary effort. So countries just volunteer what they're going to do. So it's not really very political, and it really doesn't do very much, unfortunately. But to me, it's a bridge as to how we take the science and transfer it into policy eventually. We need to step up the Paris Agreement and go to the next levels towards really reaching one of those lower scenarios. If we're going to aim for 2 degrees, then we have to work hard with the other countries to get agreements to do that. So it's going to take a lot of effort, but a worthwhile effort. A lot of studies have shown that the economic cost of not doing something about climate change far outweigh the cost of doing something. So it's to our benefit as a country and as a planet to actually economically to do something about climate change. We got to take this seriously. So, it is kind of depressing to hear all these potential major issues with climate change. But I've also always felt that we humans have dealt with issues in the past, and then we can do it again. In our own case, I mean, you can look at the stratospheric ozone issue, which I was also deeply involved with, because that's how I started my career, was studying stratospheric ozone and developing models of the chemistry and physics that affect the stratosphere. Then I moved into climate after that. And there's certainly strong relationships between the two, but they're not exactly the same issue. We developed an agreement called the Montreal Protocol that essentially all the countries in the world have signed and have contributed to, and we've actually been able to make stronger and stronger measures, just as I said we need to do with climate, over time, so that we would prevent more major changes in the ozone layer than have already occurred. And the ozone layer is already showing signs it's going to start to recover now. So we've done that. Now, climate is a more difficult problem because now we're dealing with the energy and transportation systems throughout the world to be able to solve that problem. But we can do this. And I think it's important that we consider the science as a call for action and take this very seriously. We don't want to leave a legacy to our children and our grandchildren that we didn't do something about a really major problem, because we think we're already seeing impacts from climate change, and those impacts are going to get much larger in the future decades. So solving this now, beginning to solve this now, is going to be really important.
Climate change affects different regions in different ways. So from wildfires in California, droughts in the Southwest, hurricanes in the East and Southeast, crop failures in the Midwest, and much more. And this will unfortunately lead in more lost lives and severe economic costs. On the top right, you see 2 maps that show how temperatures in the US will increase by the end of the 21st century under a lower scenario of warming and a higher scenario of warming. And you can see that the difference is quite drastic. So a study by the First Street Foundation found that we are currently seeing about $20 billion in yearly expected economic damage from flood risk across the United States. Florida and California are experiencing the heaviest losses. Florida alone accounts for nearly $8 billion a year in potential losses. For many, these costs will increase in the next decades, and you see that on the map on the right. In some cases, annual loss from flood damage could more than double by 2051. And the problem for Florida is not limited to floods. Currently, Florida experiences around 25 days of dangerous heat per year. Projections under a 2-degree scenario of warming indicates that by 2050, that number will increase more than 5-fold to 130 such days each year, more than any other state. We'll now hear from Dr. Bob Corell. Dr. Corell is a global climate scientist and principal for the Global Environment and Technology Foundation. He's also a Florida resident.
This world is changing and we have to be able to adapt it in real time. We're going to have to respond as this thing, if it's going fast, it's going to be harder to adapt to, but if it's going more slowly, it's easier to adapt to. We really do have to move to a transformation in the energy world. People ask, so why does the Arctic matter? It's just a cold place. What happens in the Arctic will happen in lower latitudes a decade or two from now, because the melting of glaciers is the most rapid in the two poles, in the Arctic and in Greenland. The Arctic melting as we have it today, and that includes Greenland and the mountains of Alaska and Canada and the Himalayas, they account for about 40% of the sea level rise. Another 40% of the sea level rise comes from just the warming of the ocean, the expansion. Those two things together account for 75 to 80% of sea level rise as we see it, know it here in Florida, because here in Florida, like some other parts of the US, we're increasing the sea level at a pace roughly 50% higher than the global mean. You know, it also dramatically affects the weather systems that we're feeling, not the least of which occurred on the 22nd of last month over Texas. If you think about it this way, up here at the pole, cold, right? Down here at the equator, warm. Any fluid is wanting to go northward, whether it be air or water, okay? It is going northward. Every single system always has a northern vector. The trouble is, it's going north on this side, but it's also going north on that side. So it can't go over the top. Because of some basic physics, it spins into a spin that we call the polar vortex. Now, until maybe 25 years ago, that polar vortex just sort of wiggled around high latitudes. Now, particularly since 1950, but dramatically over the last 25 or 30 years, that temperature difference between the pole and the equator has gotten less and less and less, because the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the equator is. And as a consequence, the spring that keeps that polar vortex up there starts to do this. It oscillates around. When it's coming down like that, the stuff up above is cold air coming down like gangbusters. And that's what happened in Texas a month ago. If you look at the pictures, you say, oh my God, you can see it, because it was coming down on the West Coast here, going back up on the East Coast, and those poor souls were there. And we had places in Oklahoma that were 17, 18, 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. I mean, it was just obscene. Before the COVID, I would go to Washington fairly frequently because I live just outside of Miami in this place called Key Biscayne, which is a barrier island. Normally, it's a 2-hour and 45-minute flight. We got on the airplane here, we landed an hour and a half later. And the pilot says, that's a record, folks. But I got into the polar vortex with a 300-mile-an-hour wind behind me. So we made some incredible effects. So then you say, oh, we got to worry about this. This has effect on a secondary system. If I go outside and look at my car right now, which hasn't been driven for quite a while, it looks dirty all over. That's dust from the Sahara, because those dust storms are also amplified and changed. And those dust storms don't come from the sand of the Sahara. Most of it comes from the dry lakes. We got hurricanes that are born in the same place, so they're moving stuff more rapidly. Some of those come all the way into the Caribbean region, then it swings through and goes up. Guess what? It's picking up all those particles that have come out of the storm, the dust storms, and moving it all the way as far north as Norway. As this stuff topples down, that affects the biogeochemistry of the ocean. Things for us to think about here in Florida, it's changing what's going on in the mangroves and elsewhere. But more importantly, all species have what we call an optimal temperature. And so those species are moving northward to find their comfort zone. So we're getting some tropical fish into the waters off our coast. And some of the things that used to be ours are now up further north into the Carolinas and even into New England. COVID had done one thing. It's told us we are all one world. And what happens here matters there, and what happens in the Arctic matters to Florida.
I'm wondering if you would like to say something about other policy solutions that you see as necessary. So that could be carbon pricing, but there's a whole range of policy solutions that are being proposed and discussed.
When Senator Kerry was Secretary Kerry was Senator, I worked a lot with him. And while he was a senator, he would call together leaders, CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the United States, like General Motors and so on. They couldn't come to grips of what taxation or all these other mechanisms, how that would play back. And one of them said, Mr. Senator, you just do it and we will adapt. But we can't tell you what's best for the country and then the world, because we're going to think about it, what's best for us. But I will never forget that statement out of the CEO, that they uniformly agreed with that principle. And then as a nation, you have to put your foot down in the larger community with whom you work, the other 96 nations, and work towards a solution. But that's a tough problem. That's why I'm so much more optimistic about the banks, because they already have the machinery. You have only one control. You have the control over the lever, okay? That's the speed at which we respond. And we do that by changing interest rates. And we make it attractive or less attractive in terms of a whole bunch of reasons. When you do this, you don't know where you're going to go. We have monetary mechanisms, but we have financial mechanisms. And those are all done at the national level. That's the problem. And maybe we have to go back and sit down again and rethink the banking system globally. Jamie Dimon, his bank, is going to invest $200 billion in stimulating and moving our nation through the banking system to supporting the transition to a new alternative energy base. That opens up a whole new ballgame. And I think we here in Florida are going to feel it, because that'll open up opportunity space for people to begin to explore in this energy world. The banking system is going to be a part of it. They are agreements and under which we can make a difference. So I think we should begin to be more optimistic, because it'll govern our behavior, but it's also true.
So what can Floridians do? Floridians who are concerned, and it's hard to see how you can, as one individual, change the whole system. But what would you recommend to people watching this? What are the steps that they can take to make a difference and address climate change?
Well, I think you could probably do a better job than I, but I bet you could give you right now a list of a dozen entities here in Florida that are trying to work towards that kind of future. Coalitions, things in Miami, a region about sea level, and all kinds of them. They need your presence, because your presence start to mount when the number of people talking and number of people speaking and speaking through this organization, whether it be a climate coalition or what have you, it makes a huge, huge difference. I see the same thing evolving in Europe. They're doing the same idea. Let's coalesce around the things where we can help entities move the ball. They need you as a person to sign on to them, so that they can say, I represent 10,000 people, not 1,000. And maybe some money can flow with that, but I would argue it's the horsepower of the presence of a lot of voices being articulated through one megaphone.
I want to ask you a final question. How do you see, whether it's on banks or on other solutions, how do you see the US collaborating with other countries?
2 years ago, we founded an entity that is called the Joint North Atlantic-Arctic Ocean Initiative. It involves about 25 countries, and they go from the Caribbean, the tip of Florida, all the way up into and around on the other side down to Morocco. The ocean becomes kind of the glue. Somewhere in the 20 to 25% of the global GDP is right here. That's a big number. And these nations are influential because they are the European nations of Germany and France and the Netherlands and Denmark, and then even Russia and Norway and Sweden and even Lithuania and others, as well as the United States and Canada, and now increasingly some of some parts of the Caribbean. And what we have put together, we call B2B. And that means from Bermuda to Bear Island. And Bear Island is an island in the archipelago of Svalbard, well into the Arctic Ocean. And we are trying to organize it and bring existing programs under this umbrella. So we call it a strategic framework. A man by the name of John Englander. John went to Greenland with us on a trip some years ago. He has a new book. This is the second edition. Yeah, Moving to Higher Ground. And it's all about the rising seas. We had a seminar just yesterday looking at a thing called Atlantos. It was funded by the European Union, and its job is to glue all the databases in a way that we benefit from them and they don't stay in their little box. And we find the mechanism in building new collaborations. And that's what this thing called B2B is all about.
Well, that's so important. It starts with collaborating on the science, exchanging knowledge, building better communication, and then
Absolutely.
you go on from there. So what can we do about the climate crisis? Well, the most effective solution is to price carbon. We need a whole range of solutions, but we cannot meet our carbon reduction goals without some form of carbon emissions pricing. Here we see research by Energy Innovation that shows that just 10 policies in 5 sectors, as well as some land use measures, could be enough to have a 50% chance of hitting a 2-degree of warming target. Carbon pricing alone could reduce emissions by more than 25% between now and 2050. That's more than any other solution. So what exactly is carbon pricing? Carbon pricing simply means putting a price on carbon emissions so that the cost of climate change impacts are better reflected in our production and consumption choices. It also gives low carbon options, for instance, solar panels, electric vehicles, which do not impact our climate, a better chance to compete in the market. There are basically 2 forms of carbon pricing. There's a carbon tax, which places a fee on each ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and cap and trade policy, which puts a cap on the carbon emissions and issues a quantity of emission allowances consistent with that cap. Carbon pricing is an economically efficient way of reducing emissions because it directly targets these emissions. As emitting carbon becomes more expensive, we all start looking for technologies and products that use less carbon. This fosters a transition to cleaner energy and drives innovation. A robust carbon pricing mechanism can put the economy in a path towards the deep cuts in emissions that the science shows are required to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Although other measures to mitigate climate change are also necessary, carbon pricing is the one solution that makes the biggest difference. And economists agree. In 2019, more than 3,000 economists signed a statement in the Wall Street Journal in support of a carbon fee and dividend approach. That included 27 Nobel Prize winners, 2 former secretaries of the US Department of Treasury, and also our colleague and co-author, Dr. Roy Wehrle. Roy is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Illinois at Springfield. Roy worked as a senior economist within the Council of Economic Advisors to President Kennedy and as an economic counselor at the US Department of State, where he was also a senior economist at Brookings Institution and has worked for decades on climate policy. So I'd like to start asking you about the carbon fee and dividend approach and why you consider this to be the right approach for the United States.
Well, the fee and dividend approach is the right approach because it gets all of the United States economy on board to do the job of fending off climate change, the worst of climate change. What I mean by that is that it enlists the entire economy. It enlists scientists, engineers, firms, everybody to find the best way to build new products that are replacements for the fossil fuel energy and goods which we must get rid of. We must replace them. And this one switch, so to speak, or one step of putting a fee on carbon will do that. Now, it's a funny sort of situation. I mean, you can call it a tax or you can call it a fee, but it's not an ordinary fee because we recommend that it be refunded to the consumer. It would be like going in and buying a product and paying for it and then having somebody send you back the money that you just paid. And so there would be quarterly dividends. But why all this rigmarole of sending money in and then getting it back? The whole point is to use the price mechanism. Economists may make many mistakes, but they understand how the price system works. If the price of pork goes up, people are going to buy more chicken and fish. And that's kind of what's going on in this situation, because we need to get people not to buy carbon energy and carbon goods. Well, how do you do that? Just make it more expensive. And the demand side of the consumer will switch to replacement products. So one side of this deal that we're talking about is to get people to move away from carbon products. And we do that by increasing the price. Every year, have the fee go up. On the other side is the supply side, which comes in to have to find replacements. Now we're very fortunate because we already have replacements for energy. In the last decade, we've decreased the price of solar, decreased the price of wind and battery and storage by 80 to 90%. So the gods of technology are on our side. They've given us a gift. And when the profit is going to go up, when people buy these, then that's going to employ literally millions of Americans in new jobs that will be well-paying jobs. And the one of the keys of the whole thing is that people will get back these refund dividends every quarter. But people do not know they're paying a tax. In other words, it's not in your bill as a tax. It's included and folded into the price that you pay for the goods that you're buying. And it turns out the fee is put on the carbon price at the coal mine and at the oil wellhead. And then that's distributed, it's passed on by the buyers all across the economy. That money that you've paid in is paid back in equal amounts to every citizen of the United States. They all get a quarterly dividend. And it turns out that 60 to 70% of the people in our country will get back more in dividends than they spent on the increased price of goods. So the increased price of goods is the mover, it's the lever, it's the engine that moves people away from the fossil fuels. But the other side, of course, is the supply side, in which the business comes in and the engineers and all the people, they realize that the tax or the fee is going to go up every year. And they know that. There's certainty. It's not the uncertainty that we've had all these different years. What's going to happen? What's Congress going to do? It's all laid out, and they can plan and innovate and bring in the replacements that will transform our economy and bring us to zero emissions by 2050. And the whole deal is that there's not much cost to it. Where's the cost? Well, business is going to make the investment in these new replacements because business is going to make a profit out of it. That's how our economy works. And the other point, of course, is that it's fair. The money comes back to the people, put it in. It's not going to be the poor who carry this on their back. It will be those who spend the most money on carbon products. But in order to stave off the climate change, this, we feel, and we've studied this all directions, is by far the best way to solve the problem.
And many agree. There are also 9 carbon fee bills in Congress. These have support from both Democrats and Republicans. Over 100 members of Congress have signed on to these different bills. There's also support from senior administrative officials, such as our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, John Kerry, Christiana Figueres, one of the key figures behind the Paris Agreement, George Shultz, who passed away last month and served as Secretary of State under Reagan. Many research centers and think tanks have done research that shows that some form of carbon pricing is necessary to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And some entities have publicly endorsed the carbon fee and dividend approach. That includes the National Academy of Sciences, the Climate Leadership Council, the Citizens Climate Lobby, but there are also a number of NGOs, such as the World Wildlife Fund, and corporations, including oil companies themselves, that support this approach. A growing number of industry leaders are coming out in favor of carbon pricing due to the clear price signal and certainty. Banks, financial markets, regulators, they are all increasingly concerned about climate risk, and they're largely coming out in favor of a robust and reliable climate policy, such as a price on carbon. We will now hear from Bob Litterman. Robert Litterman is a founding partner of Capos Capital in New York and chairman of its risk committee. Previously, he served in research, risk management, investments, and thought leadership roles at Goldman Sachs. Last year, Dr. Litterman chaired the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, which published Managing Climate Risk in the US Financial System. He's presently co-chair of the Climate Leadership Council's board and serves on several other nonprofit boards, including Resources for the Future and the World Wildlife Fund. What are the risks that climate change poses to the financial system, and how can US financial regulators address those risks?
Well, there's many types of risks that are associated with climate change. There's certainly the heat waves that we've all experienced. There's sea level rise that I think everyone's familiar with. There's the fact that there are more storms and more severe storms because the atmosphere carries more precipitation when the atmosphere is warmer. The oceans are warmer, and that means that we have more and more powerful hurricanes. In California, where I live, we have wildfires, and that affects people who live in those fire-prone areas, as well as everyone who is affected by the quality of the air, which deteriorates when you have fires going on around you. So there's many types of impacts that we're already experiencing. In addition, of course, we're going to have to get dramatic change in the amount of emissions that we create. We're going to have to get to net zero very rapidly, and that's going to mean that there are going to be changes in the way that we produce energy and many other of the things that we do, the way we travel, and so on. And so some industries are going to find that there are opportunities for them. Other industries are going to find that their services have less demand for them. So this is going to create some changing in valuations. Some folks call that transition risk. But the main impacts are going to be the physical impacts that we're already seeing and which are increasing. And no matter what we do to address climate change, are going to increase probably for the next 50 years, if not longer. These are things that are going to have impacts that we don't yet truly understand. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what might happen, whether there are tipping points. The changing climate creates increasing emissions and therefore a nonlinear response. These are some of the risks that scientists are very worried about. And then, there's also things like disease vectors that may be increased by changes in temperature and changes in ecosystems and changes in biodiversity. There's also the potential for national security issues associated with folks that are immigrating out of areas that are being negatively impacted by climate change to areas that are more hospitable. So these are all the types of risks that we have to worry about. And then, those are all risks that I would call subsystemic risks, at least most of them. But what we worry about in terms of risk to the financial system are also the fact that over time, those kinds of impacts can require government bailouts, which then impact the government's ability to finance itself. And over time, you could see a real drain on fiscal resources, not only from bailouts of those kinds of impacts, things like the freeze in Texas that we saw a few months back. Typically, we rely on not only insurance and reinsurance, but also federal government bailouts. And if those bailouts aren't available, then there's no backstop in terms of these kinds of impacts. So it's really the fiscal, solvency of the government. The other thing that's associated with climate change is the fact that there is very likely to be an expensive program of removing the pollution from the atmosphere. Direct air capture may be required at scale going forward. And that's another drain. That could be a huge drain on government resources, depending on the scale that's required.
So you argue in your report, Managing Climate Risk in the US Financial System, that putting a price on carbon is the single most important step to managing these climate risks that you just mentioned. Why is that?
Basically, the root of the problem is that we're not pricing the externality associated with burning fossil fuels. The externality is the creation of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is causing global warming. So if the root of the problem is that we're not creating appropriate incentives to reduce emissions, then the solution to the problem is let's create those appropriate incentives. And we have plenty of evidence that incentives to reduce emissions work. My firm, Kepos Capital, has created something that we call the Carbon Barometer, which measures how strong are the incentives to reduce emissions around the world and over time. And what we see is that there are very big differences in the strength of the incentives to reduce emissions. And they're not all carbon taxes or cap and trading systems either. There's gasoline taxes, which are an incentive, although not created for the purpose of reducing emissions. Obviously, if you drive an electric vehicle, you don't pay gasoline taxes. And there's all kinds of fossil fuel taxes. There's also all kinds of subsidies to fossil fuels, and similarly with renewable energy. So if we look across all the different incentives, what we find interestingly is that carbon taxes and emissions trading systems are really a small part of the total. And in fact, gasoline taxes, which are pervasive globally, are the biggest part of those incentives. So if we look, by the way, at the relationship between these comprehensive measures of incentives to reduce emissions and carbon intensity around the world, and we can show that graph, and I'll put that up right now. What you can see is that there is, on the horizontal axis, measures of the incentive to reduce emissions ranging from over $100 a ton in France, of which this is 2019, the most recent data. Less than half comes from the emissions trading system in Europe. So there are other, in particular, fossil fuel taxes in Europe and in particular France. And on the other side of this graph, we see countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Indonesia, where there are actually negative incentives to reduce emissions. In other words, there are subsidies to fossil fuels. And the fitted curve that you see here shows the inverse relationship between carbon intensity and the incentives to reduce emissions. So Europe, which have strong incentives to reduce emissions, you can see that they have low carbon intensities. The US is in the middle there, as is India and China, in terms of very weak incentives to reduce emissions. In the US, it's about $18 a ton is our estimate as of 2019. Primarily from gasoline taxes. And we're not as carbon efficient as Europe. And then in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, they're not efficient at all. They have high carbon intensity. And you can also look at the changes in carbon intensity over time, and you find the same thing. The stronger the incentives to reduce emissions, the more quickly countries are moving toward less carbon intensive economies. So the reason we focus on pricing carbon is because that's what's going to drive us to low carbon intensity and eventually to net zero, which is a goal that we're looking at for most of the world by 2050. And, it's going to take strong incentives to get there. At that point, there's going to be just as much pulling of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as going in. That's what net zero means. And then going past 2050, we're going to have to pull a lot of that CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the more we put in, the bigger is the liability, the worse are going to be the impacts, and the more risky is climate change, the more we put in. So, that's why we say it's the most urgent impact. The other 52 recommendations from the report were recommendations about managing climate risk at the corporate level or at the level of an investor or an asset owner or a region or a municipality. All of those are what we might call specific risks, and they can be dealt with. You can insure against them and so on. But what we can't insure against are the systemic risks. And the only way to insure against systemic risk is to immediately create these appropriate incentives, strong incentives to reduce emissions.
So a final question that I have for you is, you have been a very vocal supporter of a carbon fee and dividend approach, including as a board member of the Climate Leadership Council. Can you explain why this is your preferred approach to addressing climate change?
Sure. Well, this is an approach that was originally put on paper by two elder statesmen of the Republican Party, Jim Baker and George Shultz. It was really driven by Ted Halstead, who I thought was doing a terrific job. He was the CEO of the Climate Leadership Council and the chairman of its board. I was a supporter for many years. And sadly, Ted Halstead passed away tragically just in September of last year. And so Catherine Murdoch and I decided that we would co-chair the Climate Leadership Council, take it over, and we have continued this vision that Ted put together. And it's a vision that has been endorsed by a huge number of folks, any corporations ranging from ExxonMobil and Shell, Total, a number of the major oil majors and utilities, the auto companies, GM and Ford, banks, including Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, consumer companies, including Unilever and Johnson and Johnson, over just thousands of economists, virtually the entire economics profession. You can see the endorsers on our website, including Janet Yellen, who's now the Treasury Secretary. So there is widespread understanding that we need to price carbon. The CFTC report, it was the unanimous view of everyone on that, 34 stakeholders in the financial system. The National Academy of Sciences endorsed it. All of the major business organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, the American Petroleum Institute has endorsed it. We've got, endorsements from environmentalists, the World Wildlife Fund, the World Resources Institute, and so on. So everyone agrees. There's no controversy here about this. We should be pricing carbon. And the CLC, the Climate Leadership Council, brought all of these folks together, worked through a very detailed plan that includes a dividend. And dividends are important because you don't want this to be a regressive policy. You want it to be a policy that treats people fairly, that addresses a need to reduce emissions, creates appropriate incentives, and will be consistent with global incentives to reduce emissions across countries around the world. Border carbon adjustments is one way of doing that. And this plan has all of that incorporated, and it has been agreed to by all of our founding members. So Catherine and I are very happy to sponsor this going forward.
Last year, Greenleaf Communities collaborated with Dr. Roy Wehrle, an economist, and Dr. Don Weebbles, who we heard from earlier, to study how such a carbon fee and dividend policy should be designed to ensure an effective and equitable energy transition. And this led to our report, which you see on the left, addressing climate change using a carbon tax and dividend plan within a global compact. So how does it work? Well, a carbon fee is set at a rate, for example, of $25 per metric ton of CO2, and this would correspond to about 25 cents per gallon of gasoline. This fee is collected at the source, the mine for coal, the wellhead for oil and gas, and the fee increases over time, sending a signal to the markets which unleash creativity and innovation to provide the non-carbon alternatives. The rate continues to increase until a set date and level, for instance, $125 per metric ton of CO2 by 2030. The dividend means that all the revenue collected is redistributed to adult citizens every quarter. We use Energy Innovation's model to assess the effectiveness of our proposal. We looked at what would be the effect of our carbon fee if implemented in 2020 and rising until 2030. And you see that just with our carbon fee alone, we easily meet the US Paris Agreement target for 2025. And while we need to combine this with other solutions and longer-term targets, it can do more than any other tool on its own. But a fair energy transition is also crucial. Low-income communities and communities of color are particularly affected by the impacts of climate change. So it's very important that our transition to a clean economy is fair and doesn't put a heavy burden on those who are already struggling. And this is possible thanks to the dividend component. Through the carbon fee and dividend, most households are better off. In fact, 60 to 70% of households could receive more cash back dividends than they pay in carbon fees. Those who pollute the most pay the most in carbon fees, and that tends to be those who can afford it. And here you see in this table 3 potential individuals that have different income levels. And you see that those that have lower incomes get to keep more of their dividends. By pricing carbon, we're also going to see a transformation of our energy use in the next decades. The graph on the left shows how sources of generated electricity would change in the next 30 years. if the US aggressively moves towards electrification and a net zero emissions target. We see that renewables increase significantly, especially wind and solar, whereas fossil fuels are quickly phased out. And the figure on the right shows a change in total energy jobs between 2020 and 2040, in line with a 2-degree target. It shows that reducing carbon emissions and switching to renewables would create more jobs than it would displace. It could produce around 25 million peak new jobs. And these are well-paying jobs, and they're highly distributed geographically and difficult to offshore. And Leila is a computational economist working on energy and climate change mitigation at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin, Germany. She has a particular research interest in behavioral and lifestyle changes and in the interface between science, policy, and society. She's also working as a chapter scientist and contributing author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the 6th assessment reports. So first, I'd like to ask you, in your work, you chose to focus on households and individual actions as the agents of change. Can you explain why you see households and individuals as essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Human consumption in combination with the growing population contributes to climate change by increasing the rate of the greenhouse gas emission. Studies shows that a household's contribution is about 70% of global greenhouse gas emission. That's why we do need to understand which human activities are more culpable, what causes them, and how we can effectively change them. We live at a defining moment of climate change, and every single action or behavior matters. Our today's action affect our tomorrow's reality. And therefore, mitigation climate change requires holistic policy approaches that take households' behavior, lifestyle decision into account. Adding such this dimension can potentially upscale low carbon behavior and social changes to the national and global level, which is a fundamental to tackling climate change.
In your research, how did you go about trying to understand the different factors that influence consumers' energy-related behavior?
My research aimed to emphasize the importance of individual in tackling climate change. And we believe that our decision in energy-related decision or climate decision is not a one-time decision. There is a process back of that. There is many factors that influence on our decision that reach us to the final decision that we do this action. What I mean about many factors, this could be about the knowledge and awareness that we have from environment, about the climate change, about the energy consumption, renewable energies. It very much depends on our age, education, income, saving, and several other factors. And more important is really depends on our psychological factors. What I mean about the psychological factors is that how we feel. I mean, I really engage with this particular issue, and I really want to do it, which we call it personal norms, and how we feel, and what is our attitudes, what is our belief to change this basically issue. And the other important thing is the social. And when we are not alone, we are not isolated, and we are not making decisions alone. We are in the context of the society, and that society will influence on us. This could be a culture, this could be a new movement like Fridays for Future movement, and etc. That influence on our knowledge, on our awareness, and consequently on our actions. These are all kind of, I call it internal factors, but also there are lots of external factors like incentives, like subsidies that they are putting on, like a carbon pricing, taxes that encourage people or help people to change their behavior in transition to low carbon economy by reducing their consumption or changing the way of the style of the life and way of the consumption. So to do that, I mean, to capture these factors, we designed a comprehensive household survey, basically as a huge questionnaire. And we interviewed each household to really capture all these factors. Which of these factors is very important in their decision, in energy decision. And when we capture these factors, and also with help of the science, cognitive decision of the people, and also the empirical data that we get it for our survey, we design basically a tool to simulate this household decision making. And we assess the aggregated impact of this decision in energy consumption and energy demand, and consequently on greenhouse gas emission, particularly CO2 emission. This kind of modeling approach would be a supportive decision tool for policymakers, that they can run different scenarios, play with it basically to see which scenario or which policy could be a best policy for that country or that particular municipality or region.
Can you tell us maybe a little bit about what were the conclusions then of this research, and what does that mean in terms of the policy implications of your research?
Through this research, we illustrated that individual energy behavior, especially when amplified through social context, shape energy demand, consequently carbon emission. In a transition to low carbon economy, individuals become more than just consumers. In order to facilitate this transition, the broader view on social environment, cultural practices, public knowledge, producers' technology and services that they provide for us, and the facility and infrastructure used by consumers are needed to design implementable and political feasible policy options. Through our study, we showed through the running different scenarios, we showed that only single policy will not work alone. I mean, we do need a policy package. We do need a combination of the policies. Maybe I can differentiate between two types of policies, in my views, like a top-down policies and bottom-up policies. What I mean about top-down policies is that like conventional policies, price-based policies like a carbon pricing, taxing, that for a civil society, and they encourage them or help them to go toward this transition. But meanwhile, we do need also soft policies, which comes from the education, comes from the information dissemination. This is a kind of long-term policies that we invest now, but it will come back to us later. But also I should emphasize on an unbounded regional to global policies. We are not alone. I mean, that's saying, okay, climate change is a global problem. So it's not for one region or one country. And we do need different type of collaborations, from the national to the international and the regional collaborations, and put the policies short-term and long-term to help each other through the transition. I can say that is very important, not only from the individual level, it's a mission of all of us in a different levels.
I think to end the discussion today, it's easy for people to become overwhelmed with the scale of the climate crisis, and I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed and powerless to do something about it. So I was wondering if you had a message for people who are watching this and who want to make a difference and help address our climate crisis, and they might not know where to start.
Very, very good question. I can say, if in summary, every individual action, individual behavior matters. Mitigation climate change requires a massive effort from the individual, social movements to advance national and international collaborations. Each individual step, even the very, very small step towards shrinking our carbon footprint, creates a cascading changes in social behavior and consequently mitigate climate change. So we should trust on ourselves and try to do even the small action toward decarbonization and toward the low carbon economy.
Now here on the graph on the left, we see how greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the 1850s. And we see how different regions of the world contribute to these emissions. So that shows that the solution clearly has to be global. Not a single country can do it alone. And for this reason, we propose the creation of a global climate compact led by the United States to ensure that other countries join in the energy transition. And this is based on the work of William Nordhaus, professor at Yale University and recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. This plan recognizes that governments and businesses are unlikely to meet emission goals if other countries do not play by the same rules. So, to join the Climate Compact, there are two basic membership requirements. First is the implementation of a similar domestic carbon tax in each member country, and that would support the transition to clean energy at the global scale. The second requirement is the adoption of tariffs between 5 to 8% on all goods entering their borders from non-member countries. And these tariffs would encourage more countries to join the compact. And the goal is to level the playing field so that carbon pricing doesn't harm domestic industries, and two, to convince more countries to join in the effort. If the US and other major economies form the starting group, others are very likely to follow, and this could then have an enormous impact on mitigating climate change. On the bottom right, you see modeling results that show that most countries and regions would join the Climate Compact if the carbon price is not excessive and tariffs are sufficiently high. So with a $25 per ton of CO2 price and a 3% tariff, you would have at least 12 members join the compact. But with a $50 carbon price, which would have a greater effect on reducing global emissions, tariffs would need to be 5% to obtain similar results. We'll now talk with Professor Jeff Colgan from the Watson Institute at Brown University, and he will tell us about the need for global climate collaboration. So could you tell us a little bit about how foreign policy relates to domestic climate action?
Well, to be really effective, foreign policy and domestic policy have to work hand in hand on climate change. And this is because, for domestic policy, there's often resistance to taking strong climate action inside the US because opponents to those types of policies will say, well, China's not doing their share or India's not doing their share. Why should we put the costs on the United States or on American manufacturers? And so we need foreign policy action. We need a global agreement. But at the same time, we can't get a global agreement if we don't have our own house in order. Our diplomats have no credibility to talk to the Chinese and to the Europeans and others who are looking at the track record of the United States, which is unfortunately one of inaction over the last 25 years, where we really just haven't done much.
In some of your recent work, you're talking about recommendations to the new administration and including on foreign policy. And one of your recommendations has to do with creating a climate club. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how you see that would benefit the United States and the global community?
Yeah, one of the things that happens when you start to act on climate inside the United States, whether it's through a carbon tax or cap and trade systems or regulations even, however you approach it, you run the risk of putting manufacturers in the US at a competitive disadvantage compared to countries that don't have those kinds of pro-climate policies. And this is especially true for industries like steel or glass or cement that are heavy emitters, heavy industry. And so to deal with that, one way of approaching that is to use something called carbon tariffs, or they're also known as border adjustment measures, to put tariffs on the borders between countries that have strong climate policy and the ones that don't. The European Union is already looking into doing this, and they intend to go forward. They might put those tariffs on the United States if we're not careful. And the Biden administration similarly has said that they want to do this. But unilaterally, these kinds of carbon tariffs can create problems for the international trade system, which of course is designed to lower tariffs and to create more trade between countries. And so the ideal approach is for countries, particularly the really central economies of the world. And here I'm talking about three big players, the United States, Europe, and China. Those three are the biggest economic players, and they're also the biggest emitters in the world of greenhouse gases. And so ideally what we'd like to see is a climate club where those three countries agree to keep their tariffs as is, so nothing needs to change between them. But for other countries that are not doing as much on climate policy in their own territories, then those countries, potentially even including India, might face tariffs on their manufacturers, their goods, into economies that have pro-climate policy. And this sort of has its bite most strongly in the EU's relationship with its near neighbors in Eastern Europe and Turkey in Central Asia. Because that's where you see this sort of really big competitive challenge for heavy industries. And so they need carbon tariffs. This is something that's going to be necessary. The political incentive to do this is so strong. So we want to see it done on a multilateral level that helps preserve as much trade as we can, but also offers incentives for countries that don't yet have pro-climate policies to level up, right? So they don't have to face those tariffs so long as they actually do what's expected of them in terms of pro-climate policy.
And do you see this being possible with current international trade rules, the way the World Trade Organization is set up, and can that be adjusted to make a climate club possible?
This is absolutely something that's possible, although you're right to ask the question because the current policies as written at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, are a problem. They're a hurdle for this because these kinds of carbon tariffs they run against the spirit and even the letter of the current trade rules. But the new head of the WTO has spoken about her desire to see the WTO rules updated to reflect environmental concerns and to deal with what is undoubtedly the biggest global challenge today, which is climate change. And so this is something that I think has political momentum. There will be a change that's needed, but the first thing is, the countries that are wanting to do carbon tariffs, and here I'm thinking particularly of the EU and the United States, we need to figure out what we want to do first, and then once it's clear where the direction of that is going, modify the WTO rules to make sure that they're consistent.
Well, it's great to see that these international organizations are starting to take climate change seriously and prioritizing that in the way that they're working.
At last.
Yeah. I have a final question, and you already, I think, mentioned China, and China is, of course, the biggest polluter right now. And you talk about the importance of cooperation between the United States and China, and for some people that's hard to imagine right now with all kinds of other tensions going on between these two countries. So is it necessary for these two countries to cooperate, and how do you see that working out?
Yeah, the relationship between the United States and China has, of course, deteriorated quite a lot in the last 5 years. And that's something that's going to continue, I expect, post-Trump administration into the Biden administration. We're already seeing some signs of it. I hope that things will get better between the two countries. We can't count on that. But I think the thing that Americans really need to focus on is this idea of decoupling, which is kind of taken hold in Washington, where some people are thinking about, well, listen, being economically integrated with China creates all kinds of headaches for us in terms of intellectual property rights, cyber espionage, all sorts of things. And that's understandable. There are problems to be addressed there. The trouble, though, if we say, listen, we're just going to completely disconnect from China and try to go back to some kind of 1980s version of the world where the two countries are not economically embracing each other, then it becomes very difficult at that point to say, okay, we need a climate club and we need to already have China included in this. In fact, the only way one of the reasons why China would want to be part of a climate club is because it doesn't want to lose market access to Europe and the United States. Of course, that would be economically very costly for them. And so that's part of the incentive for them to get on board with a climate club and to do some of the things they need to do to change their economy. And we want that incentive to be strong. If we decouple now for other reasons, for non-climate reasons, then we've already done it. We've taken away the one incentive we really have for them to get on board with a climate club. So I hope we will resist that, even if we make some changes in particular areas. And I can understand why we might want to do that, particularly around information technology. But for most of our economy, I expect and hope that we will want to keep things relatively open.
So what you see here in this map is that carbon pricing is already happening around the world. You see that there are more than 60 countries and state governments that have implemented the policy. But the US is still absent, although there are some subnational initiatives on the West Coast and the Northeast. As of 2020, existing carbon pricing initiatives in place or scheduled around the world already covered almost a quarter of global carbon emissions. Canada implemented a carbon fee and dividend approach in 2019. And by 2017, already 7 of the world's 10 largest economies had implemented carbon pricing. The US risks falling behind in the new global energy economy as other countries move on, and it could lose its position as a global leader in technology innovation. The clock is ticking. Time is running out for us to address our global climate crisis. We must adopt effective climate policy this year. A carbon fee and dividend approach has bipartisan support and can play an outsized role in accelerating our transition to a climate-resilient economy. And while it's not the only climate solution that we need, it's our best bet for rapidly moving away from fossil fuels and leaving a safer and more resilient planet behind to future generations. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, we would love to hear from you. Feel free to contact us at the email address on the screen, and you can find more information about our research on the link to our website that's posted right here. I hope we will hear from you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you for joining us today, everyone. We work with a range of partners on policy and practice solutions to climate change and other environmental resource issues, such as fresh water, clean energy, healthy soils, and material reuse. You can read about our work and connect with us via our websites that are shown here. Thanks for all that you are doing to advance a healthy, sustainable world, and have a good day.